Sup guys? The tier list maker has just been updated with the new ships, so in this video I'll be covering the changes that I made. First, let's start with GVB and the Battleship tier list. Currently, GVB is a core part of the best bossing fleets against any armor type, boasting the highest personal damage out of all ships. However, from all the fleets I've used her in, it still feels like Lion is contributing slightly more due to her permanent and universal damage taken increase debuff, hence I have GVB in second place. She's pretty much locked to the flagship, otherwise only half her salvos will receive effects such as Eldritch's Slow or Trafalgar's evasion rate debuff, and this might not be the best sign for her longevity. If we get another ship that wants the flagship position and is just slightly stronger than her but has normal timing windows, she might end up being pushed out of the off-flag positions entirely in favor of, on paper, weaker ships like Alsace, due to her reliance on triggering those effects constantly as the flagship. GVB is also benefiting quite a lot from the other ships that are meta right now. For example, a lot of the best Vanguard buffers are either tied to the flagship firing, or just permanent, and the same goes for a lot of her common main fleet teammates as well, which makes the detriments of her halved cooldown less apparent. Let's say Helena gets a unique augment in the near future, which obviously won't happen, but let's just say that she does, and it makes her debuff chance 100% instead of 60, then GVB's usage will likely fall off a cliff. None of these hypothetically bad things have happened yet, so I obviously won't be holding them against her. And it might sound like I'm just ragging on her, but it's just because her strength is simply the fact that she deals a lot of damage to the point where she's the best in any bossing scenario, while her weaknesses are real but pretty much irrelevant right now. Moving on, I also moved Mecklenburg up one spot ahead of Alsace because she's core for heavy armor and likely medium armor as well, paired with GVB to enable her reload debuff, while Alsace's spots in fleets is typically going to be better filled by GVB. If you use GVB as the flagship, Alsace won't be able to activate Eldritch's Slow for her preload salvo, which lowers her total output by quite a bit. She's still really strong, but most of the time you'll be choosing between her or GVB for a spot in the fleet, and GVB is probably the better option. I also moved Bismarck Zwei below Kearsarge since she's not really as relevant anymore, with GVB becoming the enabler for Mecklenburg. There are two factors holding her back from being any higher. One is that she's typically used in battleship fleets but only has one salvo capacity, so her cooldowns get pushed back unless you use a faster gun on her than everyone else, which typically results in an indirect damage loss. Second is that even though she should be a buffer, the only buff she really has is for other Iron Plus ships and it's only 15% firepower, which is not really a lot compared to ships like Lion or Alsace who have universal damage buffs, while also dealing more damage. I still have Vanguard in S tier because I feel like if you put her with whatever the two best battleships are at the moment, she'll contribute more than whatever is below her, but maybe S- is more appropriate. Next, I made a separate S tier for two ships that are a cut above everyone else in campaign due to their defensive utility. Their damage in boss fights is pretty sad, so they pretty much see no use. Raffaello still occasionally finds a spot in fights where her healing can make the setup more consistent if the damage is enough, but she finds the most value when it comes to pushing through the late game campaign stages. Musashi could honestly still hold her own against heavy armor if she weren't locked to the shitty IJN guns. If she could get her enhanced barrage with the Mecklenburg gun, I think she would still be competing with Mecklenburg herself against heavy armor, but alas. That's pretty much all the changes for the battleship tier list. I also moved UVH down in S- tier since she's no longer unique in any way, with GVB being out and about. I think maybe moving Vanguard down to S- and then moving UVH and FDG down to A might be more accurate, so consider that for the next update. Now let's take a look at the Vanguard tier list changes. The most significant change is the addition of Drake to S tier with her unique augment, but it comes with some asterisks. After my initial impression of the unique augment from yesterday, I went and did some more rigorous testing of her against Hindenburg, Moskva, and Unzen, all conducted with GVB as the flagship. First, I tested her light damage against Hindenburg in the Bristol meta fight. Since Drake is still tankier than Hindenburg while using one less defensive auxiliary, I think it's fair to give her a Fumo radar to even things out a bit. In 10 runs with GVB as the flagship, Drake came out to be ever so slightly ahead of Hindenburg against light armor after adjusting for the lack of oath, which I did by just increasing her raw damage by 5%. I then did essentially the same thing for medium armor against Nasino meta, But this time I gave Moskva a Fumo radar instead, since she's tankier than Drake with one less defensive auxiliary. The result after 10 runs was about as close to a tie as physically possible. Finally, testing her heavy performance against Unzen, I gave them both one offensive auxiliary because Unzen's output spikes really hard with them. Although Drake is in fact tankier than Unzen with one less defensive auxiliary, just like with Hindenburg. Even here, Drake ended up being stronger in the average of 10 runs. I think the results against Hindenburg and Moskva are representative of real use cases. Hindenburg will have a higher ceiling if you give her 2 offensive auxiliary at the cost of survivability, but oftentimes you can't, so Drake ends up exceeding her, and by extension every other Vanguard, in terms of damage against light armor for as long as GVB remains the premier flagship. Against medium armor, Drake can outdamage Moskva if you opt for 2 offensive auxiliaries on her, which is feasible given her natural bulk, but you won't be able to use her as the main tank. I think Moskva is still more valuable against medium armor, having higher potential as a tank, no restrictions on who the flagship can be, and enabling Nakhimov's full skill set. However, they're definitely around the same level. Finally, against heavy armor, while the results are impressive, I don't think it's too representative of how Unzen gets used. She excels when she's allowed to take 2 Oxytorps and is buffed further by Carrier Amagi, for example, plus potentially utilizing Mogador's lunge to prevent her torpedoes from whiffing badly. At this point though, I don't think Unzen will be the best option for the next heavy armor boss that rolls around, but the same will probably apply for Drake as well despite her consistency. Overall, when paired with GVB, Drake is competitive with the top damage dealers against all armor types, while boasting better survivability than most of them. She does not get placed any higher than the bottom of S tier though, because given how strong main fleet ships are, it's still more practical to go with Vanguard ships that buff them as opposed to a statistic like Drake. Take a look at this run for instance. This fleet swaps out Plymouth for Drake, and Drake deals 50k more damage than Plymouth typically would, while 18% extra damage on GVB as a result of Plymouth's buff would net near 70k extra damage. Aside from that, she also lacks utility for campaign stages, compared to a lot of other ships in the tier. Plus GVB is not as good in those scenarios where ammo is a factor to consider, so it's still pretty impressive that she's made it this high off raw performance alone. Aside from Drake, I also moved Moskva and Plymouth down in the tier since they have more competition now, and also Chapter 16 is pretty hard to do without Willie D and Laffy 2, more so than 15 was for obvious reasons, so I think what they bring deserves to be highlighted more. And one last thing is I moved Kurumi next to Napoli up from B tier, because she's pretty much indestructible in campaign where she can sustain a constant supply of clones, more than I initially thought when I first placed her in B tier. Alright, that's pretty much it for this update. Thanks for watching and see you in the next one.